the governor has taken the playbook from Governor Brown and has put an $8 billion statewide block grant discretionary. That's going to count towards the ledger of mandated costs, similar to the things that happened during the Governor Brown, which is actually, pretty good fiscal planning, because as we know, while the numbers are really high, a lot of it is from that one-time capital gains from the strong year last year that we're not having this year. And that gives the way to state to adjust their budget in the future by just reducing their use of one-time funds. So that's $8 billion. There's a difference of opinion between the legislature and the governor on how to actually roll that out, and whether it's going to be targeted or and have some things that you have to spend it on. Approximately was estimated at $1,500 per student. So as I said, all those things are pending the final state budget. That will probably normally comes out being approving around the same time that we approve our final budget as well. And we would incorporate those changes into our 45-day budget in August. Next slide.
And so we wanted to just go over a quick overview over the budget certification process, since we only do this once a year. So we just wanted to remind the community, remind the board, ultimately we are approving the SACS budget that we put together. And there's some steps to it. So first we have to hold a public hearing on the budget to be adopted for the subsequent fiscal year. That's what we're going to do. We're going to have a public hearing on June 15th, and then we're going to bring it back on June 29th to adopt the budget formally. And then by July 1st, we have to file the budget with the county office. So we'll make sure on the budget office then to submit that to the county. And at the very bottom, those two paragraphs, those are just little reminders on the certification page that the board signs, ultimately to say we're asking the board to certify that the budget was developed using our criterion standards, which we did using SACS. And then we are to make sure that the budget expenditures have enough dollars to implement the LCAP, which it does. And finally, we are to disclose if we are having reserves above the minimum state required for reserves. So for us, for Fremont Unified, it's 2%. So we went ahead and added that as an attached item to the agenda item. So all that to say, we just want to make sure everyone understands that what the process is, and we're abiding by the process. So feel free to go to the next slide. And speaking of reserves, we wanted to give everybody an update on reserves. And so we have two reserves that we wanted to focus in on. First is the standard reserves that everyone has, we've talked about from year to year. It's our 2% state reserve standard for Fremont Unified. It's based on the subtotal of unassigned and unappropriated and reserves for economic uncertainties. And so we'll go over that a little bit later in the slides. But ultimately, the state requires a 2% reserve for districts of our size, that's 30,001 ADA or over. But internally, Fremont Unified requires a 3% reserve based on our board policy. So just to remind everyone, we do meet that 3% reserve and a little bit more than that. So we'll go over that more in detail in the next slides. And then the next reserve that we have to talk about moving forward is the 10% reserve cap. And it's based on the subtotal of unassigned, unappropriated amount, reserve for economic uncertainties, and other assignments. So that's kind of the new thing that we're kind of adding in there, is that other assignments is included in this 10% reserve cap calculation. And ultimately, this 10% reserve cap was triggered starting for 22-23. And so we're going to have to start abiding by this new rule, and we're going to be monitoring these two reserves moving forward. And just a reminder, non-spendable, restricted, and other commitments are not included in the 10% reserve cap calculation. So we're just focusing in on those items in the first, or in the second bullet, the first section of the second bullet. And so we have here our 21-22 estimated actuals. This is how we project to end the year. And so when it comes to our estimated actuals table, we wanted to just focus in mainly on the variance columns all the way to the right. So we have a variance dollar sign and a variance percentage. And so we wanted to focus in just starting from the top to the bottom. And so our table shows our general fund combined unrestricted and restricted dollars. That revenues increased by 0.9% or $3.9 million overall. And this increase was mainly in restricted revenues. So after second interim, we increased our other local revenues by about $1.5 million to budget for this emergency connectivity fund grant. And so that spiked up our restricted revenues. In addition, we increased special ed revenues by about $1.5 million to better align with our projections with actual revenues. So we're able to make that adjustment after second interim. And the remaining increase in revenues was due to recognizing just miscellaneous revenues and other federal, local revenues, and a child nutrition services grant that was specific for kitchen equipment and training. So that was really great that we could get that for our child nutrition services department. And then when it comes to expenditures increased also by about 0.9% or $3.8 million as we budgeted expenditures related to the newly recognized revenues. So as we budgeted the revenues, we budgeted the expenditures, and that's why you see this increase is very similar. And so the increase in expenditures is mainly seen in materials and supplies. As a result of recognizing new revenues, deficit spending did decrease by approximately $100,000. So you see that there in bold, it's that bold black there at $0.1 million. Thus the ending fund balance went from 74.5 million at second interim to 74.6 million at estimated actuals. And reserves decreased from 12.3%, as you can see at second interim. It decreased from 12.3% at second interim to 7.2% at estimated actuals. And that's because of the designations. In order for us to meet that new 10% reserve cap, we have to commit a lot of our priorities. And so that shrunk our reserve percentages, and we placed a lot of those dollars in designations. So under second interim, you can see designations row, it's about $20 million, and the designations went up by $22.6 million. So our new designations at estimated actuals, it's $42.6 million. And mainly that's for committing funds for major priorities such as PEMCA, or the Public Employees Medical Hospital CARES Act payment. And then also, most importantly, we also set aside money for a projected figure for our salary raise for 21-22, which we're still under negotiations. And then finally, we have an LCAP carryover, about $900,000 we have to set aside. The LCAP carryover is new, and it results from not spending our total supplemental grant. So if we have some dollars left over from our supplemental grant that goes to our high need students, low-income foster youth English learners, we have to carry that over to the next fiscal year, and it's roughly about $900,000. You can go ahead to the next slide, please. And so that was our estimated actuals in the orange table. Now we move on to the blue tables, which will be our 22-23 proposed general fund budget. And so for our 22-23 proposed general fund budget, we're going to start off at a high level with our combined unrestricted and restricted level. And as we move forward with the slides, we'll be drilling down into these numbers. And so on this slide, just at a high level, we're projecting about $414 million in revenue, $413 million in expenditures, and a $0.9 million surplus, which results in a $75.5 million ending fund balance, most of which will be designated for upcoming priorities like we spoke about before, 21-22 collective bargaining, settlement, etc. And this leaves about 6.6% reserves, which allows us to meet the 3% reserve requirement for Fremont Unified School District. And then we'll dive deeper into the ending fund balance and those designations on the next slide. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And so we keep talking about the ending fund balance and the new designations. So we wanted to really break it out here. And so for our designations here, we just want to show what's all in the designations in the ending fund balance. So we have revolving cash at roughly $104,000. We have our GASB 331/72 fair market value of external investments, which are cash at the county. And we have the market value there at $574,000. We have restricted, amount there at $8.2 million in our ending fund balance. There's just one, these are these restricted dollars specifically for specific reasons. So they're very controlled restricted dollars at $8.2 million. And then here we have our committed section, which is fairly new to Fremont Unified. We're now going to start making sure we commit dollars in order to meet that 10% reserve cap. because that's not part of that calculation. So we have our collective bargaining settlement for 21-22 at $29 million. That's how much we're projecting for all staff, what if we settle based on our proposal. And then we have our PEMCA payment there at $3.6 million. That's all the amounts we set aside under committed. And then for assigned, which is part of that 10% reserve cap calculation, we have our annual traditional reserve variance at 1% at $4 million. We have our Medi-Cal admin activities at $485,000. Our LCAP carryover, which is new, which I spoke about before, at $917,000. And then we have a textbook adoption, a 3-year textbook adoption that we're setting aside money for. It'll take 3 years to pay that out. And then finally, at the very bottom is our reserve for economic uncertainty. These are one-time dollars, and we have it at 6.6% or $27 million. This is the percentage that the state and the county look at when they're trying to figure out, did we meet the 2% state standard? So it's technically called Reserve for Economic Uncertainties in our SACS report. So we just wanted to kind of throw that out there, start using these technical terminologies that comes to SACS and make sure we educate the public, the board on these technical terminologies. So we have 6.6% for reserves. And go ahead and move to the next slide, please. And then the next slide, we have our proposed general fund budget, and we're drilling down a little bit deeper here. So we're going to move into our unrestricted, just our unrestricted dollars. And just for some context, I wanted to focus in on comparing our estimated actuals, our orange table from before, estimated actuals 21-22 unrestricted dollars compared to a proposed budget 22-23 unrestricted dollars, to give you guys some context on our 22-23 budget. So just focusing on the variances and the increases here. So revenues increased mainly due to LCFF COLA. As you can see there, revenues increased by about $2 million. And it increased mainly because LCFF COLA increased from 5.33% to 6.5%. And then we have expenditures, which increased. And it was mainly due to rising SPED costs, special education costs, step in column at 1.5%, which we traditionally project at. And then there's also STIRS and PERS increases that occurred in 22-23. So all that to say that's what increased our expenditures to $11.6 million. Our unrestricted general fund ending fund balance is projected to increase by $3.4 million or 5.3% as we continue to designate dollars for major ongoing expenses, like we spoke about before, like collective bargaining. And just to kind of give you guys a heads up, mainly we want to focus in on unrestricted dollars and at adopted budget, mainly because a restricted budget, we are still awaiting unaudited actuals to confirm carryover from our categorical funding. So at this point, our restricted dollars, it's not the clearest picture of what our restricted dollars are going to look like. You'll see a better picture of it at first interim, which we'll be glad to show at that time. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And so as we drill down a little bit deeper, we're now drilling into the assumptions for our 22-23 budget. And so our assumptions here, we want to focus in on our main bread and butter, which is our local control funding formula, or LCFF. So total LCFF funding is at $330.8 million. And that was an increase of about $2.9 million compared to last year, or 21-22. And then just to say the LCAP funds, or the supplemental grant for our high need students, we're projecting that at $16.6 million. And then our statutory cost of living, or COLA, it increased, like I said, at 6.56% for LCFF, but it also applies to these various programs, special ed, child nutrition, etc. We have the list here. Now our enrollment at 33,133 was based on projections from Schoolworks. Schoolworks came in December and they offered us some projections, and we decided to leverage that and use that as our enrollment projections. And ultimately to say our projection is to decrease above 1% in student enrollment, or 338 students. So we're seeing this 1% decrease from year to year. Funded ADA, 32,152.73 is based on our hold harmless funding, which is you could use the greater of the next year or the current year or the current year or the prior year. And so that's that hold harmless that still applies. And so that's what we used here. And then we have our projected 88 percentage, which is our calculation at P2 at 96.18%. So our ADA is at 96.18% currently. And then duplicated count of students or high need students for the supplemental grant is 26.85%. And moving on to the right side of the column, we have our federal revenues. So this is more of our restricted dollars and categorical funds. We have our unearned revenues, and we're going to make sure, like I said before, we'll budget that after unaudited actuals when carryover is confirmed, something that happens every single year. And then some of those are our ELOP funds or Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant, our ELOG, and then our ESSER 3. And so next, moving on to the next bullet, we have our state revenues. So we budgeted these dollars. We're going to make sure we implement the Educator Effectiveness Block Grant at $7.1 million. Some assumptions for unrestricted lottery fund, $163 per ADA. Restricted lottery fund is $65 per ADA. Our COLA towards special ed is 6.56%. And then we have a mandated cost block grant here and the dollars per ADA. Finally, we have our local revenues. Local donations are included, and we mainly base it on historical trends based on our analysis at the budget office and commitments from donors. And finally, we have our parcel tax measure I, which is projected at $4.3 million, which is pretty standard annual. And then next, we have our expenditure assumptions for 22-23. So moving on to expenditures. So we're going to start off with our salaries and our benefits, which normally make up 85 to 90% of any district. And so here for our salaries or staff, we see a net decrease of 34 FTE for certificated staff due to declining enrollment. And I just want to make sure we emphasize this is due to attrition. There wasn't any layoffs when it came to our teachers. This was all due to attrition. And then here we have our Lila Brinkhurst Elementary School, which is opening in the fall, which includes 1 FTE for a principal, 29 FTE teachers and support staff. And we have some other adjustments in different departments. HR, we have a 1.0 staff secretary, 2.0 personal techs in HR, which is really just a reclass from the current positions. We're reclassifying them to personnel techs. And then we have our speech language pathologist in special education of 4.2 FTE, and then 5.18 para-eds in special education as well. And we wanted to focus in at the bottom positions to add at our 45-day budget, but we'll make sure to operationalize this in the summer so we can continue hiring and get those staff aboard. At this point, it was a little bit too late for us to add these into the budget when we decided to approve these positions at the district level. So we're just going to make sure we add those in and budget those in at the 45-day budget. These are 1.0 custodian at Brinkhurst, 1.0 AP at Warwick and Forest Park. We're going to be splitting that. A director of child nutrition services and a supervisor of child nutrition services. And then we have 30 para-eds, which will be spent, which will be using our ELOG funding to pay for those. And to the right, we have our staffing ratios here. Nothing's changed there. Our stepping column is traditional at 1.5%. And here, STRS and PERS contribution did increase. So it increased, STRS increased by 2.8%, and then PERS increased by 2.46%. And then here, continuing just a few more details on expenditure assumptions. So as we did our discretionary budgets for our school sites, we added back in 20%. We originally reduced that in 21-22. So we're adding that 20% back into discretionary funding for our schools. So they're really happy about that. Roughly $362,000. We increased fuel and sub-agreements for special ed transportation by 10%. We're mainly looking at inflation and the cost of gas and fuel. So we made sure to budget that. We increased it by 10%. And then we're also projecting more field trips in the next year. So we increased contracts for buses for field trips, $86,000. And then also digging into our transportation budget, we had to replace a van and a mobile repair truck. They're just really old and just breaking down. So we decided to invest in that. And then special education expenditures. The contribution to special ed is $51.1 million. So that was an increase of $4.8 million to their special ed contribution. It's mainly due to NPA costs and 1.5% step in column. And then we did add some new positions, but they were offset by reductions in our contract services for NPA. So we added some psychologists, counselors, and speech language therapists, but that was offset by reductions in contract services. And then our LCAP was funded, expenditures are equal to the supplemental grant. So we made sure we're spending, we're going to do our best to not have any carryover. We're going to spend as much as we have for the supplemental grant on our high need students. And then finally, for our ESSER funds, we decided after meeting with technology to invest using ESSER funds on technology upgrades such as firewall, controllers, phones and speakers, VMware upgrades, roughly $2 million. And these are allowable uses for ESSER funds. So we wanted to really emphasize that. Some of these, the language includes purchasing for ed technology, other activities to maintain necessary operations, and then technology expenses are part of that ESSER 3 plan that we presented. So we just wanted to focus in on those investments. Next slide, please. And I'm going to pass it on to Bruce for the MYP.
Bruce, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm very careful to keep it on mute so I don't interrupt the other speakers here. So just one thing to note as we look at this MYP, the final state budget and our 45-day budget and budgets going forward as we go through the interim cycles is going to look very different from this multi-year projection. This is a snapshot based at a point in time when we know that there's a lot of good news and a lot of things going over as we kind of get through the new revenue and collective bargaining. But one thing I want to kind of point out here is we look at the estimated actuals. An important line to look at is that surplus deficit line. As you see, we are right now projecting the end of the year with a deficit of spending. And while it looks good that that deficit is going away, that deficit in the future projections it's still going to be there as we start working through our employment offers and putting the expenses for those into the budget. One thing to note is that you would expect the revenues to increase more when you look at between 21-22 and 22-23. And the reason it actually declined is because from the categorical revenue that we haven't projected and a drop off in that. And also that even though there was a large COLA projected in LCFF, without the ADA averaging, we had an 1,800 ADA drop that caught up with this from the COVID held harmless years. So we did not get the benefit in right now without the ADA averaging. We didn't get the full benefit of that 6% COLA because we had a cliff coming from that ADA drop. So when you look at it, our ending fund balance is staying fairly stable over the multi-year period. One thing you can see also after that is our designations are increasing. And the reason that that is increasing is as each year goes out, the cost of the collective bargaining settlement for 21-22 goes up for having it another year. And so we have to then make a placeholder in that year's fund balance for that. So that's why that's increasing over the years. When you look at the reserve percentage, which we put in that bucket for the reserve for economic uncertainty, you see that it's fairly stable throughout the period and has a little bit of a adjustment up in 24-25. But the reason for that is because we're increasing the revenue from LCFF, but we are not basically spending on any of our collective bargaining. So just a note in the bottom that we don't have those contingent offers in there. Based on where we're looking at with the ADA on the governor's proposal and the legislative proposal, that appears that it's going to pass. So we will then start working on those offers and getting to some agreement with our associations, and that would be put into the budget at that time. So the way that it works on collective bargaining is it gets put into the budget once we have an agreement and we go through that the AB 1200 disclosure process. So that is and we're hoping we should have a final state budget here in a couple of weeks. Next slide. So these are some of the assumptions in the budget. So when we talked about that enrollment projection, you see that the enrollment is going down as we go each year. It's a 367 student drop. It's the biggest thing happened was the cliff that came that caught up with us from the COVID years. As we ripple through the years, unduplicated is projected to go up. So as our student enrollment is going down, we expect our concentration of our unduplicated students to stay at a similar level, and an increase of those are going up. And you see that this year, as we go through, the COLA it was increased to 5.38, and then it's expected to drop a little bit in the out year at 24-25. As we know, with the way the economy is going, those numbers, the out years can change substantially as we look at the COLAs. We keep the federal and state revenues flat in the subsequent years. Local donations are included at historical trends and commitments that we have from the generous community of Fremont. And our parcel tax Measure I is projected at $4.3 million. Just to note that Measure I expires at the end of 24-25. So the district will need to either look at finding a replacement revenue source for that $4.3 million, or to reduce their budget by $4.3 million after 24-25. Next slide, please. So these are the key things to note in the expenditures as we look at the multi-year budget. The class size ratios remain the same as they have in our projected year for last year. Obviously, all those expenditures, everything is pending the negotiated salary increases as we go through, and then we will include those as we get through that process. We've included the cost of step and column, approximately 1.5%. Our pension costs, while they increased in 22-23, STRS is projected to stay flat over the next few years, and PERS is expected to come down slightly. So it appears that we have hit our peak of our increases, and hopefully we start to see that our pension costs will actually settle in, and we will not have the increases like we've had over the last 5 years. There was a transfer of funds from the ROP. That's in the budget of each year of $4.1 million for the Mission Valley ROP. And the LCAP expenditures are equivalent. We have our 17.6 and 18.2, and that it increases each year, and that is because of the COLA that is going through the years. You have to increase your spending on your unduplicated pupils, as well as our percentages going up. So while that's one thing that we have to budget as we go through, that some of that money we will then have to work through the LCAP process to serve the needs of the students, focusing on the students of need. The challenging thing with inflation that we have is our utilities and transportation costs are going up. So we have those baked in as utilities going up. Also part of our transportation costs going up each year as we are struggling with some staffing issues, and we are having to contract more on the outside for especially our special ed transportation. So that is a challenge that we are working through. And in the special education cost arenas, we're going up about $500,000 a year. These are all of our other funds. So we have, I'm not going to go and read all the different funds that we have, but as I remind people, while we spend a lot of time focusing on the general fund, we have many other funds to operate the district. The biggest fund that we kind of looked at that the board works with a lot is obviously our bond fund, the Measure E fund, Fund 21. You'll note that it has a large beginning balance. That's because we sold our final series. So that money is in there, and we will budget that throughout the year for spending. So that is it, I believe, on the multi-year. Next slide. You want to do the next steps, James?
Sure. Just to kind of round us out here at the end, just the next steps, the final adoption for 22-23 budget and the LCAP by the governing board. We're going to bring this back on June 29 for formal adoption. And then the state hopefully adopts the budget normally around the end of June, but this date is still to be determined. And then we have a 45-day budget revision. We'll bring it back in August and make those adjustments based on legislation and what they finally confirm. And then our unaudited actuals for 21-22, Robbie and the accounting team will come back in September to present that. And we still have our collective bargaining agreements that are still to be determined for 21-22. And then we have one last slide. After that, I think. There it goes. And so just to kind of leave with this quote, this kind of motto that I've always told myself in school business, because every child matters, every penny counts. It's what we do. It's why we do this job. It's why we love doing this job. We also like to just thank all the leaders, the principals, the department leaders, the accounting staff, and the budget staff for really pulling together to develop this budget for the benefit of our students. So thanks, everybody. Any questions?
Thanks, James. Thanks, Bruce. We'll open it up for questions. As we do that, I just want to go back and reemphasize some points here on the multi-year projection slide, because this can be a little bit complicated as we look at this world. It's a little nuanced between all the headlines we hear and the governors may revise and what we're hearing across the state versus what we present. And so I want to make sure it's clear for everybody. And that is that what is coming in our budget is better than what's being shown. And by that, I mean, when the ADA flexibility is passed into law, then we're able to implement that into our budget, but not before. And in addition, there are LCFF modifications that are being proposed at the state level that are not implemented into law yet. And until those change, we can't increase our revenue projections because those things aren't passed into law. In the same token, as we would expect to see those revenues increase year over year with those changes, we don't have the year over year, the out years of our offer for salary reflected either, because that's not finalized. So it is important to note when we look at our multi-year projection that this is really a snapshot in time, and the 45-day revise should and will look substantively different because of the state timeline for how they adopt the budget. It would be ideal if the state adopted the budget in May and gave school districts June to adopt their budget. But that's not how it's ever worked by the state accountability standards. So just important to note there. With that, I'll open it for questions for our group. I'll leave the screen up in case there's slide specific questions, and feel free to call out or raise your hand. I'm doing my best to work both screens at the same time. Okay. Trustee Jones, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Back on slide 8, we have the reserve variance of 1%. And I just want to clarify, is that reserve variance the additional board designated 1%, or is that separate from the additional 1% that the board sets aside in addition to the 2%?
Just being here for since February, my understanding is we traditionally set aside that reserve variance based on like a board recommendation. So we set aside that additional 1% on top of everything under assigned. That reserve variance is for that.
Okay, I since I've been on the board for only 4 years, I still feel like I don't have a huge long history with our budget. And I'm just wondering, Trustee Campbell, is that, because I thought at one point we got rid of the reserve variance. And I'm not sure if Trustee Campbell has that recollection.
Okay, so at one point, because we were anticipating declining enrollment, that reserve variance was set aside for declining enrollment to help us with that, because at one point we had underestimated the degree in which the enrollment was declining. And so in order for us to have somewhat of a cushion, we put in that 1% reserve variance. It was supposed to be on top of the 3%. So it wasn't the 1% on top of 2, it was 1% on top of 3. That was my understanding of what it was supposed to be.
And maybe the recollection I have is that in 1 year when we were doing fairly substantial budget cuts, I think we cut the reserve variance out, but I'm guessing that I guess my thought was that was permanent, but maybe it wasn't. Because now that I see it coming back, it's not something that was a permanent cut. Does that sound like what?
Yes,
Okay.
that was my understanding as well. We needed it to be able to balance during the downturn too. So that's why it's sitting there as well. It's an additional source of uncertainty, as James is calling it, reserved for uncertainty now. And so that was my understanding of why we were doing that. Again, because we had underestimated at some point the degree in which we were going to be in declining enrollment.
Okay. And I think, my other question has to do, and I understand why we can't show what we think our actual budget is going to look like until the budget is passed. So on slide 13, I think it would be helpful for me to see, even if it's we have to label it as such, a slide that would give us the projections with
A what if slide,
yeah,
what if this happens?
assuming because we're fairly confident that the budget is going to pass and that we will be committed to our offer. It would be really helpful to see what this slide looks like if that does happen, because I get nervous as we look at passing a budget in just a few weeks where I can't see what this really will look like probably. So I'm wondering if that's information that we could get.
Yes, it is. It's something we're working on and looking on, putting those analysis tools to be able to have that as soon as possible, and hopefully to be able to share at the next board meeting.
Okay, and I know there were I asked about these things. I'm in my written Q&A, but I'm also wondering, have we built in Chromebooks refreshes into our into our budget? Because I know that's coming up, and maybe it's built in there somewhere and I just didn't see it labeled the way that it made it clear to me. Are we looking at that?
I can address it. No, we currently don't have a Chromebook refresh plan. We're exploring options on how to have a formal plan and what it looks like, and how to get that in the budget. So that while we are purchasing, we got some one-time money to purchase some Chromebooks. We do not have a refresh plan at this time.
Okay, and I'm wondering if we will have that by the time we adopt the final budget. Again, I know that can be kind of a significant expense, and if we're not seeing it built in, then I get nervous that we know we have this significant expenditure out there that we're just not reflecting in our plan.
It will not be in the adopted budget. That's something that we can address and look at in future budgets.
Okay, and I know that we had some agenda items in prior board meetings looking at some serious roofing repair needs and replacement at TAC, and I'm wondering if those things are built into the budget either.
They're not built into the budget in particular. The monies are still in the budget. We are looking at bringing that facility item back at the second meeting in June. Our staff is still reviewing that. So they're not called out as a line item specifically, but the same funding that is there remains in the budget. The challenge that we face, like most things, Chromebook refresh included, is the competing interest on the dollars that exist within the budget. So they're not called out specifically as a set aside for those projects, but those dollars are still in the budget as a whole.
Okay, yeah, because I'm guessing especially with technology refreshes, we know we have to do that, especially when we have state standardized tests that rely on a certain level of technology. We know it's really not a choice at a certain point about whether or not we refresh our technology. We have to do it. And so if we know we have to do something like that, I think it makes sense to budget it in, because we need to set aside those dollars because it's expenses that we know we have to have, and we don't want to make it look like we have more money to play with than more money to use in other areas if we really don't have that money.
Right,
Anyway.
and that's a point that our budget staff can certainly look at, and that's part of where the 45-day revise may look very different. And I know it's conceptually, it can be frustrating and challenging for everybody in school finance and for our trustees and our administrators, our staff, and our community. But I think it's important to know that the budget adoption process in June is important, but it doesn't prevent us from making adjustments at the 45-day revise or at the first interim. Each one is a snapshot and an opportunity to make adjustments in our planning and our expenditures. And I think this is one of the key frustrations of the timing for the state level budget, because for the county to certify our budget, if we were to include all of the things that the governor is proposing, which some districts may elect to do, the county would require that you then take them all out at the same time. And so it just is very unhelpful to have the sequence of events the way it is. And so I think it's really, the 45-day revise will be a more informative point in time than this point in time, but it is the process we're engaged in. Other questions from the committee? Task force, sorry.
I'm
Trustee
sorry,
Campbell.
I just have one quick question, and it's about transportation. Has there been any budgeting considerations around bringing back home to school transportation?
We have not budgeted for home to school transportation for all of our students. The transportation budget that's reflected now is our obligation to transport as is currently designed. And that includes there's an agenda item for contracted services to help with that obligation, because we're short drivers, as most districts in the state are. And then we have an increase in the funding for fuel costs as well. But we have not built in any budget plans for the entire school population, home to school transportation, like we used to have way back when.
It wasn't that long ago.
Well, yeah.
It wasn't that long ago, maybe 3 years, maybe. Mr. Superintendent, my concern is that the agenda item says it's $1.5 million in additional funding that we're going to need to support transportation costs for field trips, et cetera. But in this budget, it only says, I forget what page it's on. If you go down to, go back to.
Yeah, it says 86,000.
Right, 86,000. Where does that come from?
So I'll let the finance team review the details of that, but ultimately the agenda item that is on the agenda for Wednesday night is a contract for services that cover home to school transportation for our special education students, as well as field trips. So that's a larger agreement in total. And then this $86,000 is specific to the expected need for increased field trips. And perhaps James, you can help me with this, but I believe that 86,000 is part of the 1.5, the 1.5 being a larger agreement for additional services for our student transportation.
Yeah, that's correct. When we were doing our zero-based budgeting, we projected an increase to the current set aside for field trips by $86,000. So here we were just trying to emphasize we're increasing it by $86,000. So it's part of that whole $1.5 million that they have as an agenda item.
And
So
I can speak.
the rest of the, okay, go ahead, Mr. Colby.
Yeah, so the item, the $1.5 million contract is replacing contracted services that we were using from some more expensive services that we had. It was our ability to use the bigger buses and the yellow buses. We were using some other smaller van services that were more expensive. So it's not a $1.5 million increase in the budget. It's a $1.5 million contract that's offsetting other contracts we were using for this current year.
I see. And the difference between what we had and what we need is the $86,000, which is already incorporated in the 1.5.
Correct.
Yep.
Okay. And then I understand about having to replace vans and mobile repairs. When you say mobile repair, is it's gonna, are you buying new vans and then repairing one? And that seems like not enough money to buy vans. I don't, is it a van, or can you share more?
Sure, it's actually a mobile repair truck. So it's actually a truck that goes around to repair. So there's actually two different automobiles we have here. We have a van and then a truck that needs to be purchased just because it's totally run down in the transportation department. I think they've had that truck since the 90s or something like that.
So you're replacing the truck and you're repairing the mobile repair truck.
No, we're replacing the van and we're replacing the mobile repair truck.
Oh, you're replacing both of them. And
Yep.
And is that an increase in cost? Because I was gonna say, I know two vehicles is more than $137,000.
Yes, that's two vehicles. That was the projection for two vehicles from the transportation department when we were trying to figure out how much this would cost.
So where's the money coming from? If you're increasing the budget, what are you taking it from the general fund?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a long overdue investment when I was talking to transportation, and just something that we've kicked the can down the road for so many years and just kept putting bandage over bandage for these vehicles. And they said at this point, we're just spending too much money on repairing it versus just, biting the bullet and replacing it.
No, I completely understand that. So you already have $100,000 in there already to help purchase the vehicle?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay. That's all I have. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So we've got about 4 minutes left. Are there any other comments or questions from the group? I saw a hand go up and then my screen just changed. Go ahead.
Just a question about the ESSER technology grants. On the last bullet, it says technology expenses are part of the ESSER 3 plan. Is there a differentiation between 1, 2, and 3, I take it? Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, all the ESSER dollars are permitted for this purchase, all 1, 2, and 3 allocations. And we identified through our work that we needed these VMware upgrades very early. We weren't sure if we'd have enough ESSER funds in total to get them done. And we pushed this to the back a little bit to make sure we could prioritize some other ESSER purchases first. And we recognize that this is a problem because if we don't upgrade our firewall, our network is subject to going down very easily. We don't want that to be the case. And so that's where the $2 million comes from. And ESSER 3, when we wrote that plan, we called out the technology needs in that plan. James, I don't know if you have other information that's helpful in clarifying that.
The only thing I could add is when we were talking to technology, these are the ultimate must-have, or the district is susceptible to, just going down technology-wise. And so we really brought down their requests down to just the must-have items that you see here that we could use for ESSER funds.
So with that, we're going to close out this meeting because we have our board budget subcommittee meeting starting in 2 minutes, which some of us need to jump onto. So I do appreciate everybody being here. Again, this will be presented at our board meeting on Wednesday night for a hearing, and then it will come back at the second board meeting in June for adoption pending board approval, and then go forward to the county for certification. One last tidbit is you saw in the presentation the AB 1200 related to negotiated settlements. And if you're not familiar with that, once we reach an agreement with any of our represented groups, CSEA, SEIU, or FUTA, then we are obligated to send to the county a certification of how we can pay for and afford the raise that is being offered. And so whenever we reach a negotiated agreement, we need to submit what they call the AB 1200 to the county, and that is why that's noted as well. So with that, I thank everybody for being here. I know my staff will be in communication about our next dates as we move forward. And I thank everybody for their participation in our task force this year. It's much more enjoyable to have these conversations than the ones we did the year prior about reductions. And so we hope we can continue to get good news from the state, be good stewards of our dollars locally, and keep having conversations like this. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.